The gavel cracked against wood with a sound no louder than a twig snapping underfoot. Yet that small, sharp noise shattered the entire frame of Lenora Holbrook's world. She felt the vibration not in her ears but through the worn soles of her boots, a tremor traveling up from the courthouse floorboards into her bones, into the hollow space behind her ribs where her heart used to beat with hope. It was done. The farm, the house her husband had built board by board with his calloused hands, the soil that held his sweat and now held his body beneath the old oak tree, all of it belonged to the bank. Lenora stood motionless in the courtroom. Her spine remained straight despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders, a weight that felt heavier than all the earth in Montana. Behind her, she could hear the soft shuffle of her children on the wooden bench. Callum, 13 years old, sat with his arm wrapped around his little sister Willa, who had just turned 6 3 weeks ago. There had been no birthday celebration. There had been nothing to celebrate. The boy's jaw was set in that hard way he had learned in the months since his father died. Too hard for a child his age. Too necessary for the man he was being forced to become. At their feet lay Bramble, their border collie, his ears pressed flat against his skull. The dog had not made a sound since they entered this building of polished wood and cold justice. Animals always understood things that humans tried to hide from themselves. The man across the table slid a single folded document toward her. His name was Orville Finch. He wore a tidy mustache, and his fingernails were so clean they seemed merciless against the ink-stained pages of debt and default. His face held no particular cruelty, which somehow made everything worse. He was simply doing his job. Her complete ruin was merely paperwork to him. Another file to close before lunch. The document was not a reprieve. It was a deed to the last remnant of the Holbrook holdings, a sliver of limestone badlands on the county's western edge. Land deemed worthless for grazing, worthless for farming, worthless for anything except holding the territory together on a surveyor's map. Its only distinguishing feature was a cave, a dark mouth in the rock that most considered a liability, a wound in the earth that decreased the property's value to nearly nothing. Finch offered it as settlement of the final accounts, a gesture that cost the bank nothing and gave her less than that. Lenora reached out and took the paper. Its crispness felt like an insult against her calloused fingers. She had $2.17 remaining in this world, a small, cold weight in her pocket that would have to stretch across a lifetime that suddenly seemed very short indeed. She did not look back at her children. She could not bear to see their faces. Outside the courthouse, the October air carried the first sharp bite of approaching winter. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the proceedings stood in small clusters on the wooden steps, their voices dropping to whispers as she emerged through the heavy doors. They did not meet her eyes. Their pity hung around her like a suffocating blanket, and she wanted nothing more than to tear it away from her skin and leave it crumpled on the ground behind her, widow. Unlanded, a ghost in the making. She was 38 years old, and the world had already decided she was finished. Lenora walked down the courthouse steps without looking back. The sound of her boot heels on the boards was steady and deliberate. Bramble fell into step beside her, his paws silent, his loyalty unquestioning. Callum followed with Willa's small hand gripped tight in his own. The little girl's shoes made soft, uncertain sounds as she struggled to keep pace. The rhythm of their footsteps on the dusty street was the only music left to accompany them into whatever came next. 8 months earlier, life had worn a different face. Not easy. Life on a Montana homestead was never easy. But there had been warmth in the farmhouse kitchen when the winter winds howled outside. There had been laughter around the dinner table when Silas told his stories. There had been love in the small moments between the endless work. There had been Silas. Her husband had been a big man with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or split a cord of wood before breakfast. The kind of man who filled a doorway when he stood in it. The kind of man whose absence left a hole in the air itself. He had built their home board by board and nail by nail, working through 2 brutal winters until the walls stood straight and true against everything the Montana sky could throw at them. But the farm had struggled despite his efforts. Bad weather 3 years running. Harvests that barely covered the seed cost. Then his mother Edna had fallen ill, and the doctor bills had piled up like snowdrifts, blocking every door. Edna Holbrook had been more than a mother-in-law to Lenora. She had been a teacher and a confidant, a second mother when Lenora's own had passed years before. The old woman's weathered hands had guided Lenora's through 100 household tasks: how to preserve vegetables so they lasted through the coldest months, how to read coming weather in the color of clouds, how to stretch a single meal to feed unexpected guests without anyone leaving hungry. They had spent countless evenings together by lamplight, Edna's voice soft and patient as she shared the accumulated wisdom of her 67 years. German remedies passed down through generations, prayers that had sustained her through her own hardships, stories of the old country that Lenore would never forget. When the sickness came for Edna, it came slowly and then all at once. The doctor bills mounted. And Silas had taken work at the stone quarry 15 miles east, leaving before dawn and returning after dark with gray dust in his hair and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He never complained. That was not his way. The last morning Lenora saw him alive, he had stood in the kitchen doorway with his lunch pail in one hand and his battered hat in the other. Early light slanted through the window and caught the silver threads beginning to show at his temples. Callum had been eating breakfast at the worn wooden table, and Silas had ruffled the boy's hair with rough affection. "When we pay off this debt," he had said, "I am going to teach you to ride proper. We will go up into the high country together, just the two of us. See if we cannot find some elk." Callum had nodded solemnly, trying to look like a man, though his chin barely cleared the tabletop. Silas had crossed the kitchen then and kissed Lenore on the forehead. His lips were warm. His hand lingered on her shoulder. She remembered thinking she should tell him to be careful, but the words seemed unnecessary. He was always careful. He would come home that evening, same as every other evening, tired and dusty but whole. Bramble had trotted after him to the gate, same as every morning. The dog always waited there until Silas disappeared over the ridge, then returned to the house to begin his daily patrol of the property. The quarry collapsed at 2:30 that afternoon. Lenora was stirring a pot of soup on the stove, the kitchen warm with steam and the smell of onions, when she heard Bramble's howl from the yard. Not his usual bark at a passing rabbit or distant coyote. This was something else entirely. A sound of pure animal grief that raised the hair on her arms and stopped her heart mid-beat. The dog had come home alone, hours before anyone from town arrived with the news. He had known. He had felt it somehow across all those miles. She did not remember dropping the pot. She only remembered the scald of hot water across her feet and the way the world had tilted sideways and refused to right itself no matter how hard she gripped the edge of the counter. 3 men dead in the collapse, they told her. Silas and 2 others buried under tons of limestone that would take days to clear. The foreman had tears running down his weathered face when he delivered the news. "Silas Holbrook was the best man I ever worked with," he said. "I am so sorry." They buried Silas beside his father beneath the oak tree on the hill overlooking the farm. Lenora had stood at the grave with her children pressed against her sides, watching the dirt fall on the pine box, and felt something inside her chest turn to cold, heavy stone. 3 months later, Edna finally lost her fight. The old woman had seemed to shrink after her son's death, as if grief was slowly consuming her from within. She stopped eating, stopped rising from her bed most days. The light in her eyes, that sharp German intelligence that had guided Lenora through so many difficulties, grew dim and distant. In her final hours, fever stole most of her words, but she had summoned strength from somewhere deep within, clutching Lenora's hand with surprising force. Her eyes suddenly clear and urgent. "The western land," she had whispered. "The cave. Silas knew. He was going to show you. He said there was something there. Something that could save you if the worst ever came." Then her eyes had fluttered closed, and her grip had loosened, and she was gone. Lenore had sat beside the empty body for a long time, holding a hand that would never squeeze back, left with a mystery she did not understand. Now, standing in the October chill outside the courthouse, she finally understood. Silas had known about the cave. He had explored it, studied it, seen something in that worthless land that no one else could see. He had been waiting for the right moment to share his discovery, waiting until the debt was paid and they had time to plan properly. He had run out of time, but he had left her a clue. He had left her a direction to walk when every other path was closed. The journey to collect their belongings was the longest walk of Lenora's life. The house that was no longer hers stood quiet in the slanting afternoon light. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The curtains she had sewn hanging in the windows, the rocking chair on the porch where she had nursed both children, the marks on the kitchen door frame where she had measured their height each birthday. None of it belonged to her anymore. The bank did not want these small personal items. They wanted the land, the buildings, the livestock that had already been sold at auction. The worn quilts and chipped dishes were beneath their notice. Lenora moved through the rooms like a woman walking through her own funeral. She gathered what she could carry: a cast-iron skillet, blackened by years of use, seasoned with 1,000 family meals, a wool blanket that still held the faint scent of cedar, and something else she refused to name: a small axe with a worn handle, a sack of dried beans, Silas's oil lantern, dented and faithful, a wooden crate containing 3 nervous chickens who clucked their confusion at being disturbed. Callum helped without speaking. He was old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to feel the full weight of it pressing down on his young shoulders. Willa did not understand. She wandered through the empty rooms asking questions that had no answers. Where are we going, Mama? When are we coming back? Why does the house feel so sad? The hardest moment came at the front door. Lenora stood with her hand on the smooth, familiar wood of the latch. Her palm knew every groove and wear mark in that brass plate. For 10 years, this door had been the threshold between her world and everything else, the boundary between safety and uncertainty, home and the vast unknown. Now it was just a door, someone else's door. She pulled it shut. The quiet click echoed with a finality that matched the gavel's crack. The sound sealed her past away, locked it behind wood and glass and memories she could not afford to carry. She stood under that vast, indifferent sky with nothing but a worthless deed and a future as barren as the land it described. They walked 8 miles before sunset. The town fell away behind them. Neat fences and plowed fields gave way to rougher country. The dirt road became a track, then a path, then nothing at all. They navigated by landmarks Silas had mentioned in passing conversations she was only now remembering. Past the lightning-split pine, through the gap in the Red Rock Ridge, follow the dry creek bed until it bends north. Callum carried Willa on his back for the last 2 miles when her small legs refused to go any further. The boy did not complain. He simply knelt in the dust, let his sister climb on, and kept walking. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his jaw remained set. Bramble ranged ahead of them along the trail, then circled back to check their progress, then ranged ahead again. The dog's ears swiveled constantly, alert to sounds the humans could not hear. He kept looking at Lenora with those intelligent brown eyes, as if waiting for her to turn around and lead them back to the life they had known. She did not turn around. By the time they reached the property line, marked by a single rust-colored iron stake driven into the rocky ground, the sun was bleeding orange and purple across the jagged silhouette of the distant mountains. The light painted everything in shades of ending. The land was exactly as worthless as its reputation suggested. Gray rock jutted from the thin soil like broken teeth. Gnarled skeletal bushes were the only vegetation, their leaves already withered to brown paper that rattled in the evening breeze. The ground was more stone than dirt, hostile to any seed foolish enough to try taking root. And there, at the base of a low, crumbling escarpment, was the cave, its mouth gaped dark and wide in the rock face. A silent howl of surprise carved into the cliff. The opening stretched broad enough for a wagon but low enough that a tall man would need to duck his head. Beyond the entrance, darkness swallowed everything. Absolute, complete, impenetrable. A cold draft breathed outward from those depths, carrying a scent of damp stone and ancient stillness. It smelled like a place that had been waiting for a very long time, waiting for someone desperate enough to enter. This was her inheritance. This was her refuge. The thought was so bleak, so completely devoid of hope, that a dry, humorless laugh escaped Lenora's lips. The sound was swallowed immediately by the immense quiet of the Badlands, as if the land itself found nothing amusing about her situation. She set down her belongings. The chickens clucked nervous protests in their crate. Willa pressed closer to her brother's leg, her eyes wide as she stared at the dark opening. Callum's hand found the small knife at his belt, a gesture that was becoming habit. "Mama," Willa said in a voice barely louder than the wind, "is this where we live now?" Lenora looked at the cave. looked at the barren land surrounding it, looked at the last golden light fading from a sky that did not care whether they survived the night. Yes, she said. For now, she could not bring herself to say more. Have you ever stood at the mouth of darkness and wondered if stepping through would save you or swallow you whole? Lenora was about to find out, but what she discovered inside that cave would change everything. Stay with me. The first night was a vigil of fear. Lenora built a small fire near the cave's entrance, gathering dry brush and dead branches from the surrounding scrubland. The meager flames pushed back the darkness by a few precious feet, creating a small pocket of warmth against the vast, cold night. She rationed out a handful of dried beans for each of them, cooked in water from the canteen she had filled before leaving town. The blandness was fitting for their new circumstances. Willa ate without complaint, too exhausted to fuss. Callum chewed mechanically, his eyes fixed on the fire, his thoughts somewhere far away. Bramble lay pressed against Willa's side, sharing his warmth with the shivering girl. The dog had not left the children's vicinity since they arrived. He understood his job now. Protect the young ones. Keep them safe through whatever was coming. Later, wrapped in the single wool blanket, Lenora lay on the hard ground and watched the stars emerge overhead. The same constellations she had taught Callum to name when he was small enough to fit in her lap. The Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, the North Star that Silas had used to navigate home on dark nights. But here those familiar patterns offered no comfort. They were just points of light scattered across an endless empty blackness. Cold and impossibly distant. Indifferent to one woman's grief and two children's fear. Every scrape of stone in the darkness made her flinch. Every rustle of wind through the dry brush was a potential threat. The night sounds of the Badlands were foreign and frightening, after years of knowing exactly which creature made which noise on her own land. But the greatest threat was not outside. It lived inside her own mind. The cold, heavy certainty that she had been sent here to die. That the cave looming behind her was a tomb waiting to receive her body and the bodies of her children. That the world had cast them out, erased them from the community of warmth in human society, left them to expire on a piece of land that was itself a testament to worthlessness. She did not sleep that night. She watched the fire burn down to embers, watched the embers fade to white ash, watched the first gray light of dawn dilute the darkness in the eastern sky. Morning arrived not with a gentle sunrise, but as a slow, reluctant brightening. The world resolved itself into shades of brown and gray. The air was bitter with the promise of coming frost. Lenora sat up, her body stiff and aching from the hard ground. She was still alive. The fact registered as a small, hard kernel of surprise in her chest. She had half expected the night to swallow her whole, to wake up and find herself somewhere else, or to not wake up at all. Callum was awake too. The boy sat with his back against a boulder, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance, his hands still resting on the knife at his belt. He had been keeping watch, a 13-year-old boy standing guard over his family because there was no one else left to do it. Something cracked inside Lenora's chest, not grief this time, something harder and sharper, something with edges that could cut through despair if she let it. She climbed to her feet. It was time to see what Silas had found. The lantern's golden glow was a fragile weapon against the profound darkness within. Lenora stepped through the cave entrance with Bramble padding silently at her heels. The dog's nose worked constantly, reading scents that human senses could never detect. His ears pricked forward, alert but not alarmed. That was a good sign. If danger lurked in these depths, Bramble would know before she did. She had told Callum to stay outside with Trolla. The boy wanted to argue, she could see it in his eyes, but something in her face had silenced him. This was something she needed to do alone, at least the first time. The cave's opening was low and wide, but the passage quickly narrowed as she moved deeper. The limestone walls pressed close on either side, slick with a film of moisture that glittered in the lamplight like scattered diamonds. The air grew heavy, still, and noticeably colder than the night had been outside. It felt like walking into the belly of some great sleeping beast. Each step took her further from daylight, further from the world she knew, deeper into the unknown heart of the earth. For the first 50 feet, the cave was simply a tunnel. The floor was uneven, packed earth mixed with fallen rock that threatened to turn her ankle if she moved too quickly. She saw evidence of animals that had sheltered here in the past, old droppings scattered in corners, a few bones picked clean by scavengers, too old to identify, but the space was empty now. Whatever creatures had once called this place home had moved on long ago. Despair began to settle over her like a familiar weight. This was no shelter. This was a hole, a damp, dark, lifeless hole in the rock. She had been a fool to come here, a fool to imagine anything other than a slow, cold end for herself and her children. The townspeople had been right to mock her. The bankers had been right to take everything. She was nothing but a foolish woman, following a dead man's half-remembered words into oblivion. The walls pressed closer. The ceiling dropped lower. She had to crouch, then nearly crawl, the lantern held out before her like an offering to the indifferent darkness. But she did not stop. Something drove her forward. The same stubbornness that had kept her spine straight in the courthouse. The same refusal to simply lie down and surrender that had carried her through the deaths of her husband and mother-in-law and the loss of everything she had ever known. If this cave was to be her grave, she would at least see all of it first. Then the tunnel began to open. The ceiling rose away from her reaching fingers. The walls retreated into shadows beyond the lantern's reach. Lenora stood upright, holding the light higher, and felt its glow swallowed by an immense volume of empty space. She had stepped into a cathedral of stone. The chamber stretched before her, its true dimensions hidden in darkness, its ceiling lost somewhere far above. The floor was relatively flat here, scattered with loose rock and patches of clay, but mostly navigable. The air was different in this space, cleaner somehow, less stagnant, as if the cave itself was breathing. And then she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it beneath her own heartbeat and the blood rushing in her ears. Drip, 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 steady, patient, rhythmic as a pulse. It was the most reassuring sound she had heard in months. Following the echo, she found a place where the rock wall wept. A slow, constant seep of water, clear and cold, trickled down the limestone face and collected in a shallow basin worn into the stone floor. The basin was perhaps 2 feet across, its edges smoothed by centuries of patient erosion. Water pooled there, still and clean, reflecting her lantern light like a mirror to another world. Lenora knelt beside it. She cupped her hands and drank. The water was sweet and pure, filtered through 100 feet of limestone, carrying minerals that tingled on her tongue. Cold enough to make her teeth ache. Delicious beyond anything she had ever tasted, because it meant survival. A spring, an underground spring that flowed year-round, protected from drought and flood alike, immune to the freezing temperatures that would soon grip the land above. This water would not ice over in winter. This water would not run dry in summer. This water would sustain life in any season. This water was hope. Bramble lapped at the basin beside her, his tail swaying in what might have been the first wag since they left the farmhouse. Then as she knelt there mesmerized by the miracle of clean water in a barren land, the quality of light around her changed. A pale ethereal beam pierced the darkness from somewhere high above. Lenore looked up, craning her neck, following the light to its source. High in the cavern's ceiling, barely visible against the black rock, was a fissure, a long, narrow crack that opened to the sky far above. Through it, a shaft of morning sunlight streamed down into the heart of the mountain, illuminating a circle of floor in the center of the chamber. She stepped into the beam. Warmth touched her face. The light fell around her shoulders like a blessing, like a hand reaching down from heaven to say, here, right here. This is where you begin again. For several hours each day, as the sun tracked across the sky overhead, this chamber would be bathed in direct natural light. The geometry of the crack and the Earth's rotation meant growing seasons would have illumination. Not as much as an open field beneath full sky, but enough, possibly enough. The air in the chamber was still and calm. The massive limestone walls absorbed fluctuations from the outside world and held everything within at a constant temperature. Not warm exactly, not cold either, simply stable, unchanging. A pocket of constancy in a world of brutal extremes. This was not a tomb. This was a fortress. This was a machine for survival, powered by geology and light and water and time. And then Lenora saw something that stopped her breath entirely. Near the base of the far wall, Tucked into a crevice at shoulder height was a piece of folded paper. She crossed the chamber on legs that trembled. Her fingers shook as she pulled the paper free from its hiding place. The page was yellowed and creased from being folded and refolded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. She knew every loop and angle of those letters. She had seen them on shopping lists and love notes and the deed to their farm. It was Silas's handwriting. Water at 50 paces from entrance, the note read. Light at center from crack above. Temperature stable year-round, warmer than outside in winter, cooler in summer. Good soil can be brought inside. This could work. We could grow food here if we had to. Lenora's knees buckled. She sank to the stone floor with the note pressed against her chest, and something that had been locked tight inside her finally broke open. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The sound that escaped her throat was half grief and half something else entirely. He had known. Silas had known about this place. He had explored it and studied it and recognized its potential. He had been planning to show her, to explain his idea, to share this secret hope that might save them if everything else failed. He had run out of time, but he had left her a message. He had left her a map. He had left her, even in death, exactly what she needed to survive. The idea took root in that moment of grief and revelation. It was an impossible idea, a farmer's dream in a place where nothing was supposed to grow, planting a crop inside the earth itself, raising food in the darkness where no plow had ever turned soil. Madness. Everyone would call it madness. But Silas had believed it could work. He had studied this place and made calculations and written those words in his careful hand. This could work. She trusted him. She had trusted him with her life for 15 years. She would trust him now, even though he was gone. She would trust his knowledge and his judgment and the love that had driven him to search for any way to protect his family. Standing in the beam of sunlight in the heart of the mountain, Lenora Holbrook made her decision. She would plant corn in this cave. She would grow food in the darkness. She would prove everyone wrong, or she would die trying. It was an act of rebellion against the verdict the world had passed on her and on this land. It was defiance made tangible, hope given form. For the first time since that gavel cracked against wood in the courthouse, a feeling other than grief or fear stirred within her chest. It was a sliver of something hard and sharp and bright. It was resolve. The work began with the most fundamental element, soil. The floor of the great chamber was mostly stone and clay, unsuitable for cultivation. The thin, scraggly topsoil outside was barely worthy of the name. But it was all she had to work with. The labor would be brutal. She knew this before she lifted the first handful. She did it anyway. Lenora used the cast iron skillet as a makeshift spade, its weight and edge capable of scraping dirt from between rocks. The empty bean sack became her carrier. Each morning before the sun climbed high enough to send light into the cave, she would work the scrubland outside, filling the sack handful by handful, spoonful by spoonful, patiently gathering what the hard land grudgingly surrendered. The sack, when full, became a dead weight that pulled at her shoulders. She had to drag it across the rocky ground, had to haul it through the narrow throat of the cave entrance, had to carry it 50 feet through darkness to the chamber where the light would fall, then return for another load, and another, and another. Her back screamed in protest. Her hands, once merely calloused from farm work, were soon raw, then blistered, then hardened into thick leathery pads that cracked and bled and healed and cracked again. The first week she managed to create a patch of soil in the sunlit circle no larger than her blanket, a dark smear on the cavern floor that looked pathetic, insignificant, a child's attempt at farming. But it was a beginning. Callum joined her on the third day. The boy had watched her work in silence for 2 full days, asking no questions, his face unreadable. Then on the morning of the third day, without being asked, he picked up a second container and began hauling soil beside her. He did not speak, neither did she. There was nothing that needed saying. They worked. Willa helped in her own way. The little girl took over care of the chickens, feeding them scraps and collecting the eggs they produced. She named each hen with the seriousness of someone bestowing titles of nobility. Marigold for the golden brown one, Biscuit for the speckled one, Pepper for the small fierce one with dark feathers. She talked to them in the high sweet voice of a child and the birds clucked back as if they understood every word. Bramble watched over them all. The dog appointed himself guardian of the family's new territory, patrolling the cave entrance at regular intervals, sleeping beside Willa each night, following Lenora through the passages as she worked. His presence was a comfort beyond measure, a living reminder that loyalty still existed in the world. Deeper in the cave system, Lenora discovered another resource: bat droppings. The smell was powerful enough to make her eyes water, but she remembered reading somewhere that guano made excellent fertilizer. The ancient deposits had accumulated over decades, perhaps centuries, forming dark piles in the deeper chambers where the bats roosted. She spent days scraping the dried waste from cave floors and walls, mixing it into the soil she had labored so hard to gather. Filthy work, degrading work, the kind of work that would have made the ladies in town gasp and turn away in disgust. Lenora no longer cared what anyone in town thought about anything. She was building something, creating something from nothing, fighting for her children's lives with nothing but her hands and her will and the knowledge her dead husband had left behind. By the end of the first month, she had constructed 3 long raised beds of rich, dark earth. Each bed was positioned precisely within the path the daily sunbeam would trace across the chamber floor. 8 feet long, 2 feet wide, 10 inches deep. Over 200 trips through darkness, carrying load after load until her shoulders burned and her legs trembled and her vision blurred with exhaustion. The physical cost was immense. Every muscle in her body ached. Her joints creaked like old hinges when she moved. At night, she collapsed onto her blanket, too spent to even build a fire, welcoming the cave's darkness as relief from the strain of endless labor. She ate sparingly, rationing the beans, knowing that her survival depended on a harvest that was still nothing more than a desperate gamble. But something fundamental had shifted. The cave was no longer a place of exile. It was a workshop, a laboratory, a sanctuary. It was home. The trip to town was a necessity she dreaded. She needed seed corn. She needed lamp oil. Her supplies were running dangerously low, and the planting window was slipping away with every day that passed. If she waited too long, even the protected environment of the cave might not be enough. Lenora left Callum in charge of Willa and Bramble, gave him careful instructions, and walked the 8 miles back to Cooperton alone. The town looked the same as it always had. The same storefronts with their painted signs, the same horses tied to hitching posts along the main street, the same women in their clean-pressed dresses walking between the mercantile and the church. But it felt different to her now. Or perhaps she was the one who had changed. The rhythms of commerce and gossip seemed frivolous now, disconnected from the fundamental realities of water and soil and shelter that governed her existence. These people worried about the price of fabric and the scandal at the mill. She worried about whether her children would see spring. The bell above the door of Brennan's General Store rang with its usual cheerful jingle as she pushed through. The sound felt entirely out of place. Harlan Brennan stood behind the counter, a man whose spine seemed made of the same rigid wood as his shelves. He looked up as she entered, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face before he could school his features into merchant neutrality. He had probably expected never to see her again. Lenora walked to the counter. Her dress was worn and stained with cave dirt. The soil beneath her fingernails stood in stark contrast to the store's orderly displays of goods and bolts of clean fabric. "I need seed corn," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. "And a gallon of lamp oil." Brennan raised an eyebrow. "Planning this late, Mrs. Holbrook? First frost is due any week now." His tone carried no kindness. It was the voice of a man confirming his own assumptions. Just then the door opened and another customer entered. Virgil Suttner. He was a farmer who had owned land bordering the old Holbrook property. A man of 52 years with weathered skin and opinions about everything. He saw Lenora and stopped in the doorway. A slow, spreading smile crossed his face. The smile of a man about to enjoy himself at someone else's expense. He leaned against a barrel of pickles and folded his thick arms across his chest. "Well, well, well," he drawled, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Still kicking, I see. Heard you were living in that old cave out on the western edge. Figured a rock slide might have saved you the trouble of facing winter." Lenora kept her eyes on Brennan. She would not give Suttner the satisfaction of a response. The corn, she repeated. Brennan made a show of weighing out the seeds, his movements deliberately slow, designed to prolong her time in the store. Time for others to see her reduce circumstances. Time for the whispers to build. A young man near the back of the store laughed. Clyde Jessup, barely 24, the kind of person who found cruelty entertaining. What is she going to grow in a cave? Rocks? Maybe she should try mushrooms. That would make more sense. Snickers rippled through the store. An older woman near the fabric bolts shook her head with theatrical pity. Prudence Sutner, Virgil's wife. Poor thing, she said to no one in particular. Lost her husband, lost her home, now losing her mind. Someone should inform Reverend Whitmore. This is not natural behavior. The humiliation burned across Lenora's cheeks like a brand, but she met it with a cold stillness she had cultivated in the darkness of the cave. She had hauled tons of earth with her bare hands. She had slept on stone and eaten scraps and worked until her body screamed for mercy. A few stinging words were nothing. She placed her coins on the counter. The sound of metal on wood was sharp and final. She took the sack of seed and the can of oil. As she turned toward the door, she paused. For the first time, she looked directly at Virgil Sutner. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmurs like a blade through fog. A person has to plant where they can. She did not wait for a response. The bell jingled her departure, and she left behind a silence heavy with smug certainty that she would fail. The mockery was a fire in her belly as she walked home, but it was not destructive fire. It was fuel. They saw a mad, grieving widow making foolish choices. They had no idea they were looking at a farmer about to begin the most important season of her life. Back in the sanctuary of the cave, the insults faded to irrelevance. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the clean scent of damp earth and ancient stone. It washed away the dust and judgment of the world outside. In here, only the work mattered, only the soil and the seeds and the thin hope they represented. Lenora laid out the kernels of corn on a flat stone. Small, hard golden promises, each one a potential plant, each one a tiny gamble against overwhelming odds. She began to plant. The work was meticulous, a ritual of hope performed in the heart of living rock. She pressed each seed into the dark, rich soil of the raised beds, spacing them with the practiced care of a lifetime spent working the land. Her fingers knew this motion. Her body remembered the rhythms of planting even here. Underground, in a place where no crop had ever been sown, she was not just planting food. She was planting a future. She was planting defiance. Callum helped, following her instructions without question, learning by watching as she had once learned from her own mother. Willa helped too, pressing seeds into the dirt with small, careful fingers, treating it like a game because she was too young to understand the stakes. We are putting them to bed, Mama, the little girl said. They will sleep and then wake up as corn. Yes, Lenora whispered, that is exactly right. The whole town bet against her. They laughed at her struggle and waited for her to fail. But Lenora had something they could not see and could not understand. She had her husband's knowledge, she had her children's trust, and she had a will that refused to break. Would it be enough? Stay with me to find out. With the planning done, life settled into a new rhythm. A rhythm dictated by the sunbeam from the fissure and the needs of her underground crop. Each morning she checked the soil's moisture by pressing her fingers into the dark earth. She used a small cup to transfer water from the seep in the wall to the beds, giving each emerging plant exactly what it needed. Not too much, which would rot the roots. Not too little, which would stunt the growth. Just enough to sustain life in the darkness. During the hours when direct sunlight streamed through the crack above, she would sit near the beds and watch, a silent guardian of the impossible garden. The light fell in a golden column, illuminating the dark soil, and she studied every inch of it for signs of change. When the sunbeam passed each day, she would light the lantern and move it slowly along the rows. The artificial light was weak compared to the sun, but every bit helped. Every hour of illumination increased the chances that something would grow. She found herself talking to the plants as she worked. Grow, she murmured. Please grow. Grow for my children. Grow for Silas. Grow because I need you to. She knew it was foolish, speaking to seeds buried in dirt, but in the silence of the cave, her voice was the only human sound, and the act of speaking made her feel less alone. Old Matthias Gruber came to visit on the 15th day. He was a German immigrant, 78 years old, who lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. Most people avoided him. They said he was strange, that he talked to himself, that he had peculiar ideas about things that proper people did not discuss. Lenora had never spoken to him before. He appeared at the cave entrance one afternoon, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick, his white beard tangled with bits of leaf and twig. Bramble growled softly in warning, but did not bark. "I heard what you are doing," the old man said. His accent was thick, his English rough, but clear. "They say in town that you have lost your mind, planting crops in a cave." Lenore stood in the entrance, blocking his view of the interior. "What do you want?" Matthias smiled. It was a kind smile, full of gaps where teeth had been, but warm with genuine interest. "In Bavaria, where I grew up, we had caves too. My grandmother stored vegetables in them all winter. 55 degrees always, summer and winter. The earth keeps its own temperature." He tapped his walking stick against the rock. "Everyone here thinks they know everything. They do not. The old ways work when the new ways fail." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small cloth bag. "Wood ash," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Mix it into your soil. It will help the corn grow stronger." Then he turned and shuffled away without another word, leaving Lenora standing in the entrance with the gift in her hands and moisture prickling at the corners of her eyes. She was not entirely alone after all. Reverend Josiah Whitmore came on an afternoon in early November. He was a tall, thin man with a face like a disappointed hatchet and opinions that he shared whether anyone wanted them or not. He had made his concerns known throughout the town. The Holbrook widow was engaging in unnatural practices, living in a cave like an animal, attempting to grow crops underground like some kind of pagan witch. He stood at the cave entrance with his Bible clutched to his chest, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Mrs. Holbrook," his voice carried the weight of moral authority, "I have come out of concern for your immortal soul. This life you are leading, this dwelling in darkness, this attempt to force nature against God's design, it is not the path the Lord intended for his children." Lenora looked at him for a long moment before responding. "With respect, Reverend," she finally said, "God made this cave. He put water inside it and light at its center and walls that hold warmth when the world outside turns to ice. I am only using what he provided." Whitmore's thin lips pressed tighter. "That is dangerous reasoning, Mrs. Holbrook. You are teaching your children to live as outcasts. What kind of future do you imagine for them?" "The kind where they survive," Lenore replied. "I will take my chances with the Lord's judgment." She turned and walked back into the darkness, leaving the Reverend standing at the entrance with his undelivered sermon and his impotent disapproval. 40 days after planting, the first green shoot broke through the soil. Lenore was checking the beds in the pale morning light when she saw it. A tiny, pale spike, no bigger than her smallest fingernail, pushing up through the dark earth. Fragile as a prayer, stubborn as hope. She fell to her knees beside the bed. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the tender leaf. It was real, it was alive. It had grown from a seed she planted, in a cave, underground, in a place where everyone said nothing could survive. Her shoulders began to shake. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The release that swept through her was overwhelming. Months of grief and fear and desperate labor breaking loose all at once. She pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sounds escaping her throat. Callum found her there a few minutes later. He stood at the edge of the planting beds, looking at the tiny green shoot, and his face changed in ways Lenora would remember for the rest of her life. The hard mask cracked. The boy who had been forcing himself to be a man let out a sound that was equal parts grief and joy, and his composure finally shattered. He sank down beside his mother, his shoulders heaving, his face pressed against her arm. "Papa was right," he choked out. "He was right. Mama, it works." She pulled him close and held him, while the weight of months lifted just enough to let them breathe. Bramble whined and pushed his nose against their legs, and Willa came running to see what all the fuss was about. When the little girl saw the tiny plant, she clapped her hands and laughed with pure delight. "Look, Mama, the corn woke up." The corn matured through the autumn weeks with quiet determination. First came more shoots, pushing up through the soil in a ragged green line. Then the stalks began to grow, reaching toward the light that streamed through the crack above. The plants were pale, much lighter than field corn grown under open sky. They stretched upward with an almost desperate urgency, every leaf oriented toward the precious sunbeam. Willa called them ghost corn, and the name stuck. To any normal farmer, the plants would have looked sickly, etiolated and strange. But Lenora saw them differently. She saw survivors. She saw adaptation. She saw life finding a way in impossible circumstances. The first real test came in late October. A cold snap swept down from the north, dropping overnight temperatures to 15 degrees. Frost painted the scrubland outside in glittering white. Shallow puddles turned to solid ice. The last brown leaves fell from the skeletal bushes and lay like brittle paper on the frozen ground. Inside the cave, nothing changed. The massive limestone walls held their constant warmth, indifferent to the freeze outside. The temperature remained stable and mild, while the world above locked itself in ice. Lenora stood at the cave entrance that morning and watched her breath plume white in the frigid air. Then she turned and walked back to her planting beds, where the ghost corn stood green and growing in conditions that should have been lethal. She thought about Virgil Sutner, scrambling to protect his livestock from the sudden freeze, about Clyde Jessup losing animals because he had not prepared properly, about the women in town huddled close to their stoves and complaining about the price of firewood. They were struggling out there. She was thriving in here. The harvest began in the third week of November. Lenora picked the first ear of corn with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. She peeled back the husk slowly, layer by layer, revealing the rows of kernels beneath. They were not golden yellow like normal corn. They were pale, milky white, almost luminous in the lamplight, like kernels carved from bone or pearl. "Ghost corn," Willa whispered, peering over her mother's shoulder. "I told you, Mama." Lenora cooked it that night over a small fire at the cave entrance. The taste was unlike anything she had expected, sweet and earthy and complex in ways that sun-grown corn never achieved. The lack of full light had concentrated the sugar somehow, intensified the flavors. It was not better than regular corn. It was simply different, its own thing entirely. It was survival made edible. She harvested the rest of the crop over the following days. Each ear was examined and husked and laid out on flat stones to dry. When she finished counting, she had 47 ears. Not a large harvest, a fraction of what she could have grown in a proper field under open sky. But it was enough to supplement the beans and eggs, enough to make cornmeal that would stretch through the winter months. The sight of that small pale mountain of corn was more beautiful to her than any sunset. It was food. It was warmth. It was her answer to the courthouse and the smug faces and the laughter in the general store. Old Matthias came again as November drew to a close. He stood at the edge of the planting beds with his gnarled hands folded over his walking stick, studying the harvested corn with an expression Lenora could not quite read. "You did it," he said finally. "The crazy widow grew corn in a cave." The words might have sounded mocking from anyone else. From Matthias, they carried a tone of benediction. The old man looked up at the crack in the ceiling, then at the water seeping down the wall, then at the raised beds of dark earth. "In the old country," he said quietly, "we knew things. Things that people here have forgotten. The earth remembers even when men choose not to." He turned to face her directly. "You have remembered, Frau Holbrook. That is good. That is very good." He moved toward the entrance and then paused and looked back. "There is weather coming. I feel it in my bones, a bad storm. The kind that comes perhaps once in 20 years. He tapped his stick against the stone floor. "You will be safe in here. The others will not be so fortunate." Then he was gone, shuffling away across the frozen ground, leaving Lenora with a warning she did not fully understand. The signs came slowly at first. Birds left early. Whole flocks of geese abandoned the valley weeks ahead of their normal schedule, their formations ragged and urgent against the gray November sky. Deer moved down from the high country in numbers Lenore had never witnessed. Dozens of them streaming past the cave entrance, their eyes wide with instinct that humans had long forgotten how to read. Bramble grew restless. The dog paced constantly now, whining at sounds Lenora could not hear. His ears would prick at nothing. His nose would test the wind, as if searching for a scent not yet present, but approaching. The sky turned a color that defied naming. Not quite gray, not quite yellow. Something in between that felt wrong on a level deeper than sight. Lenora began preparing for whatever was coming. She stacked extra firewood near the cave entrance, filled every container with water from the seep in case something disrupted the flow, reinforced the heavy wooden barrier she had built across the opening, bracing it with stones so it would hold against wind and weight. Callum helped without being asked. The boy had learned to read his mother's moods, and he recognized the urgency in her movements. "Is it going to be bad?" he asked one evening as they worked. Lenora looked at the bruised and swollen sky. "Yes," she said. "I think it will be very bad indeed." The storm arrived on December 23rd, 1887. It did not come gradually. It attacked. One moment the sky hung heavy and threatening, but still. The next moment a wall of white came screaming down from the north, like the wrath of every winter god ever imagined. The wind struck first, a howling blast that nearly knocked Lenora off her feet as she rushed to secure the entrance. Then the snow came, not falling but flying horizontal, driven by winds that shrieked and tore at everything in their path. Visibility dropped to nothing in seconds. The world disappeared behind a curtain of white so absolute that Lenora could not see her own hand at arm's length. She got the barrier closed just as the full force hit. Inside the cave, the roar of the storm faded to a distant, muffled howl. The massive weight of stone above transformed the blizzard's fury into something almost peaceful. A battle raging in another world entirely. For 3 days, the storm held the land in its grip. Outside was chaos and death. Wind speeds reached 70 miles per hour. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Snow piled in drifts 20 feet deep. Roofs collapsed. Livestock froze where they stood. Anyone caught in the open died within minutes. Inside the cave, Lenora sat with her children beside a small fire and listened to the apocalypse happening somewhere far away. The contrast was absolute. Out there, a maelstrom capable of killing anything it touched. In here, stability and warmth. Out there, people dying. In here, Willa asking for a bedtime story. Lenora told her about Silas, about how he had found this cave and recognized what it could become, about how he was still protecting them even though he had gone ahead to whatever came next, about how the ghost corn they had grown came from his belief that impossible things could be achieved through patience and hard work. Willa listened with wide eyes and fell asleep with her head in her mother's lap. Callum stared into the flames and did not sleep at all. The wind died on the 4th day. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound, an absolute stillness that pressed against the ears like held breath. Lenora pushed open the barrier and stepped outside. The world had transformed completely. Where scrubland and rock had been, there were now only smooth, undulating waves of white stretching to the horizon in every direction. The snow had buried everything. Trees that had stood 20 feet tall were reduced to small mounds. Fences had vanished entirely. The landscape looked like a frozen ocean, its swells and hollows carved by winds that had raged for 72 straight hours. The sky above was steel gray and utterly motionless. Nothing moved anywhere. It was as if the world had died and been replaced by this white silent emptiness. Then she heard something in the distance. A voice, faint and desperate, calling her name. A figure appeared on the ridge above the cave. A man struggling forward through drifts that reached his waist, waving his arms, shouting words she could not quite make out. As he came closer, stumbling and falling and dragging himself up again, she recognized him. Virgil Suttner, the man who had mocked her in the general store, the man who had laughed at her planting corn in a cave, the man who had wished a rockslide would spare her the trouble of winter. He was not laughing now. His face was gaunt and gray with exhaustion. His clothes were torn. His eyes held the wild, desperate look of an animal caught in a trap. Behind him, barely visible through the snow, came his wife Prudence, the woman who had spread rumors and shaken her head with theatrical pity. She was stumbling, held upright only by her husband's grip on her arm. "Nora," Virgil gasped as he reached the cave entrance. His voice was a ruined croak. "We saw your smoke. We did not know if you would still, if you could possibly." He could not finish. His barn roof had collapsed on the 2nd day. His winter stores were ruined. His livestock were dead. His house was buried so deep in snow the doors would not open. They had not eaten in 4 days. "Please," he whispered. The words seemed to cost him everything he had left. Then his knees buckled, and he sank into the snow before her. The man who had mocked her was kneeling at the entrance to the cave he had called her grave. This is the moment in when everything changed. When the people who laughed came crawling back. When power shifted completely. But what would Lenora do? Would she turn them away? Would she make them suffer for their cruelty? Keep listening to find out. Lenora looked at Virgil Sutner kneeling in the snow. She looked at Prudence, barely conscious, her lips blue with cold. She thought about the mockery, the cruelty, the laughter in the general store, the rumors Prudence had spread, the bets Clyde Jessup had taken on her death. She could say no. She had every right to say no. These people had shown her no kindness when she had nothing. They had wished her dead. They had treated her as a fool and an outcast and a madwoman. But she also thought about Silas, about what kind of man he had been and what kind of woman she wanted to become, about what her children were watching and learning. And she thought about her own mother, gone so many years now, who had always said that strength was not about having power over others. It was about what you chose to do with power when you finally had it. She made her decision. I cannot feed the whole town, she said. Her voice was flat and practical, empty of gloating. But I can trade. Virgil looked up at her, confusion cutting through his desperation. It was not charity, not handout. It was a transaction that preserved dignity on both sides. Trade for what? His voice was barely a whisper. I have nothing left. You have strong arms, Lenora replied. And there is dead wood on the ridges that the storm did not bury. I need firewood stacked and ready for burning. A week of cornmeal for a month of cut wood. It was a fair exchange, labor for sustenance, the foundation of something new. Virgil nodded, and the relief that flooded his face was almost painful to witness. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you. Lenora stepped aside and let them enter the warmth. Over the following days, more people came. They struggled through waist-deep snow to reach the cave that had once been a punchline. Their faces carried mixtures of hope and shame. They came because they had nowhere else to go, because their preparations had failed, because the storm had broken them. Clyde Jessup arrived with his young wife and two small children. The man who had taken bets on Lenora's death stood at her entrance with his hat crushed in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. She traded with him the same as everyone else. Fair terms, equal exchange. The Henderson family came, 4 children under 10 years old, their small faces pinched with hunger. The mother carried a baby barely 6 months old, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the cold. Harlan Brennan came. The storekeeper who had watched her humiliation with cold indifference now stood before her, looking at the underground farm with undisguised astonishment. I was wrong, he said. The words seemed to cost him something important. I have candles and lamp oil and salt. I will trade for meal. Whatever you think is fair. Dr. Ephraim Locke came, having made the dangerous journey through snow still waist-deep in places. He tended to those suffering from frostbite. He checked the children for signs of illness. He marveled openly at the conditions inside the cave. The temperature in here, he said, writing careful notes in a small book. A 26-degree difference from outside. Remarkable. Someone should document this properly. 17 people sheltered in the cave during the worst of the aftermath. Lenora organized them with the same practical efficiency she had applied to building planting beds. Each family received a section of the cave for sleeping. Blankets were shared according to need. Food was rationed carefully. The fire at the entrance was kept burning constantly, more for light and morale than for warmth, since the cave maintained its own stable climate regardless of what happened outside. The days in the cave became a strange kind of community. People who had never spoken before found themselves sharing meals and stories. Children from different families played together while their exhausted parents rested. Old grievances were set aside because survival required cooperation. There was no room for petty feuds when everyone depended on everyone else. Among those who came was a boy named Josiah Sutner, Virgil's 10-year-old son. He had a healing bruise on his cheek and eyes that reminded Lenora of Callum, the eyes of a child being forced to grow up too fast. He stood apart from his parents, watching the cave's interior with undisguised wonder. Is this where you grew the ghost corn? He asked quietly. Lenora nodded. Can you teach me how? It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of something larger. a passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the very thing that had brought her here in the first place. Yes, she said, I can teach you. Over the following days, Josiah became Callum's shadow. The two boys worked side by side, hauling water, tending the small fire, helping wherever they could. A friendship formed between them that would outlast everything else. On the eighth day, a small miracle occurred. Emma Henderson, 7 years old, had been silent since arriving at the cave. The trauma of nearly freezing to death, the fear and confusion of being uprooted from everything familiar, had locked something inside her. She would not speak. She barely ate. She sat in a corner with her arms wrapped around her knees and stared at the stone wall. Dr. Locke had examined her and found no physical cause. Sometimes the mind protects itself by retreating, he explained to the worried mother. She may return to us. We can only wait and hope. On the eighth day, Bramble walked over to where Emma sat. The dog had been busy during the crisis, moving between families, standing guard at the entrance, accepting grateful pats from children who found comfort in his steady presence. But something drew him to the silent girl. He sat down beside her, close but not touching, patient and still. For a long time, nothing happened. Emma stared at the wall. Bramble sat beside her. The cave continued around them. Then, so quietly that only those watching closely could hear, Emma spoke. Can I pet the dog? Her mother's hand flew to her mouth. Bramble moved closer and placed his graying head in the girl's lap. Emma's small fingers came down to stroke his fur, and for the first time since the storm began, she smiled. It was a small moment in the larger story of survival and disaster. But everyone who witnessed it understood they had seen something important. The healing had begun. The crisis lasted 3 weeks. By the time the snow had settled enough for travel and the temperatures had climbed to merely brutal rather than lethal, the community in the cave had become something new. Bonds had formed in the darkness. Debts had been created and repaid. A different economy had emerged, based on trade and mutual aid rather than competition and isolation. When the refugees finally left to return to their damaged homes, they did not leave empty-handed. They left with knowledge. 7 families began digging storage cellars that spring, copying the principles Lenore had demonstrated, creating underground spaces for food preservation. 12 families started composting systems based on her methods. 3 families began planning cave expansions for emergency shelter. The woman who had been mocked as crazy had become the most important teacher in the county. Virgil Suttner returned to the cave one afternoon in early March. The snow was finally melting, revealing the devastation beneath. Dead livestock, collapsed buildings, fences buried under debris. The land looked like a battlefield. Suttner stood at the entrance with his hat in his weathered hands. He looked older than before the storm, thinner, more worn, but something had changed in his eyes. Mrs. Holbrook, he said. His voice was rough, as if the words cost him effort. I need to say something. Lenore waited. I was wrong. 3 words hanging in the cold air between them. I called you crazy. I laughed at you in front of the whole town. I told everyone you would be dead by spring. He took a deep breath. I was the fool. You built the only thing that could have saved us. You saw what was coming, and you prepared. I saw nothing. I understood nothing. Lenore studied his face. This was not the same man who had leaned against a barrel and drawled insults at her. That man had been confident in his superiority. This man had been broken by the storm and was trying to rebuild himself into something better. What you did, Suttner continued, taking us in when you had every reason to refuse, trading with us instead of turning us away, sharing what you knew instead of keeping it secret. He shook his head slowly. I do not know if I would have done the same. You would have, Lenore said quietly. Your children were hungry too. That is what parents do. Suttner was silent for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. I would like to learn, he said, whatever you are willing to teach. I want to understand what you understand. Lenore took his hand and shook it firmly. It was more meaningful than any apology could have been. Reverend Whitmore came too eventually. He stood at the cave entrance with his Bible still clutched to his chest, but his face had lost its rigid disapproval. The storm had taught everyone humility. Mrs. Holbrook, he said, I told you this was not God's way. I was wrong. Lenore raised an eyebrow but said nothing. God gave you wisdom, the Reverend continued. wisdom I was too blind to recognize. You saved lives. You showed mercy to those who showed you none. He looked into the cave at the garden beds visible in the pale light. Perhaps this place is more sacred than any church I have stood in. It was as close to an apology as Josiah Whitmore was capable of giving. Lenore accepted it with a nod and let him leave in peace. Clyde Jessup came last of all. The young man who had wagered on her death walked up one afternoon with something in his hand, a small cloth bag that clinked when he moved. $5, he said without preamble. I bet $5 you would not survive until spring. Lenora looked at him steadily. I was cruel, Jessup continued. Stupid and cruel. He held out the bag. This is the money. I am giving it to you. It cannot undo what I did. But it is something. Lenora took the bag. I am not asking forgiveness, Jessup said. I know I do not deserve it. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Lenora stood at the entrance for a long time after, feeling the weight of the coins in her hand. What a powerful lesson in forgiveness and grace. Lenora had every reason to be bitter, every reason to turn people away or demand they grovel. Instead, she chose to build something new from the wreckage. She chose to be the person her husband would have been proud of. That is true strength. 20 years passed. The Holbrook Cave became something of a landmark in the region. People from neighboring counties made the journey to see the underground garden and hear the story of the widow who survived the Great Blizzard of '87. Callum grew into a man who carried his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. He studied agriculture at the Territorial College, though his real education had come from the darkness of a limestone cave. His writings on underground climate stability were considered radical at first. Within 2 decades, they were being cited in textbooks across the nation. He married a school teacher named Sarah, who had heard the cave farmer story and wanted to meet the family. They raised 4 children who learned to plant ghost corn before they learned to ride horses. Willa became a teacher herself. She taught the children of Cooperton not just reading and arithmetic, but the stories of their community. How it had nearly perished in the Great Blizzard. How it had been reborn in a cave. How her mother had proven that impossible things were possible for those stubborn enough to try. She married Josiah Sutner, the boy who had once asked to learn about growing corn underground. Their wedding was held at the cave entrance, with Lenora's blessing and the whole community in attendance. Lenora herself remained in the cave she had transformed from refuge to home. Her hair turned silver, her hands grew more gnarled. But she never stopped working, never stopped teaching anyone who came to learn, never stopped adding to the knowledge she would leave behind. Bramble died in the spring of 1898. He was 14 years old, ancient for a working dog. He passed in his sleep with his graying head resting in Lenora's lap, the same way he had spent so many nights through so many winters. They buried him near the cave entrance, beneath a stone that Callum carved with steady hands. Bramble, faithful through every season. Lenora wept that day for the first time in many years. Then she dried her eyes and returned to her work. There was always more to do. Lenora Holbrook died in the winter of 1912. She was 63 years old. She passed peacefully in her sleep, in the cave that had saved her life and become her legacy, surrounded by the walls that had sheltered her through 25 winters. Callum and Willa were both there at the end, holding her hands, telling her stories about her grandchildren and the farm and the community that had grown around her teachings. The funeral was the largest Cooperton had ever seen. People came from miles in every direction. Farmers and teachers and doctors and merchants. People who had sheltered in her cave during the Great Storm, and people who knew the story only secondhand. They stood in the cold March wind and listened to Reverend Whitmore, old now himself, speak about a woman who had shown them what was possible. They buried her beside Silas, beneath the oak tree that had somehow survived both the Great Blizzard and all the years since. Her epitaph, carved into simple stone, said what needed saying. She planted where no one believed anything could grow. The story did not end there. In 1978, a team of researchers from Montana State University came to investigate the Holbrook Cave. They had read the old accounts and wanted to verify them with modern instruments. What they discovered astonished the scientific community. Deep in the cave, they found journals that Callum had kept, preserved in the stable air. Detailed records of temperature and humidity and crop yields spanning decades. Meticulous observations that would have impressed any modern agricultural scientist. They rebuilt Lenora's original system and took measurements of their own. The temperature inside the cave fluctuated by only 3 degrees throughout the entire year, 52 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of conditions outside. The same stability she had relied on nearly a century before. The principles she had discovered independently, the researchers realized, were being applied in modern passive house design. The same concepts guided construction of the Amundsen Scott Research Station at the South Pole. A widow with nothing but determination and her dead husband's notes had pioneered techniques that the most advanced architects of the 20th century were only beginning to understand. The Holbrook Cave was designated a Montana Historic Site in 1984. Today, hundreds of visitors come each year to walk through the chambers and hear the story of the woman who refused to surrender. They come not just to see a cave. They come to remember that sometimes the places others dismiss as worthless contain everything needed for survival. And sometimes the people the world abandons are the ones who see most clearly. This is the end of Lenora's story, but in many ways it is also a beginning. Her legacy lives on in the techniques she pioneered, in the lives she saved, in the lessons she taught us all. That resilience is not about having everything. It is about making the most of what you have. That knowledge does not come from books alone. It comes from observation and patience and the willingness to try what others say cannot be done. That sometimes the darkest places are where the brightest hope can grow. We all face caves in our lives, moments when the world decides we are finished, when every door seems closed and every path seems blocked. Lenora's message across all these years is simple. Plant anyway. Thank you for listening.